All right, hello. Today we're beginning the Jeffersonian era, aka the first start of the period four of AP US history. So, during period four, the United States begins to develop a modern democracy and celebrate a new national culture, while Americans sought to define the nation's democratic ideals and change their society and institutions to match them. There's also an increase in There's also an increase in innovations in technology, agriculture, and commerce. They all powerfully excelled the American economy, percepting profound changes to the U.S. society and to national and regional identities. These regional identities would lead to an increasing growth in sectionalism. The U.S. also had an increasing interest in foreign trade and expanded its national borders, shaped by the nation's foreign policy and spurred government and private initiatives. So, the election of 1800 is very interesting for a couple of reasons. First off, there is, by this point in U.S. history, a clear establishment of political parties. You have the Democrat Republicans and the Federalists. There was many key debates between the two political parties, with debates over tariffs being the single largest issue. The relationship between Jefferson and Adams was also heavily uh, strained. They were once close political allies, having written hundreds of letters back and forth to one another. However, growing tensions between the two halted communications for John Adams' presidential term. This hiatus nearly lasted for 5 years, 1796 to 1801. Both Jefferson and Adams used the press to slander one another, but ultimately Jefferson ended up tying for the most votes with Aaron Burr, meaning Adams did not get the presidency. With a tie by the Electoral College, the decision for who becomes president goes to the Senate. Hamilton petitioned the Senate to elect Jefferson to the presidency over Burr. Ultimately, Jefferson got the presidency, Burr the vice presidency. This would create more tensions in between Burr and Alexander Hamilton. With that, though, with the election of 1800, Democrats took control over the House and the Senate, as well as the White House. But before we talk about uh, Adams handing over the presidency to Jefferson, good old John Adams has one last act to declare. So, Federalists saw that they were going to lose power in the two branches of government, and as such, they decided to push through a new law that would appoint Federalist judges to positions in the federal court system, just before power was being handed over to a new political party. After taking office, Jefferson refused to let the judges take their seats in the court, and ultimately this would result in the Supreme Court case of Marbury versus Madison. We'll discuss this a little further on in the lecture. But for now, the Adams and the Federalists tried appointing judges to the court systems. For now, Jefferson has taken control of the White House. He declares it a revolution of 1800 because the first time power was peacefully transitioned between two competing political groups. And it is at this time, 1801, that Adams and Jefferson's letters resume, with Adams having written a letter to Jefferson about horses that were on White House grounds, actually. It was about horses, and they were in the stable, and that he was going to leave them there for Jefferson. Jefferson ended up calling Adams respectable, and tensions between the two began to fade. And their letters began resuming. Abigail Adams started sending letters to Jefferson again as well. and they ended up having a pretty good relationship for the rest of their lives. But that's enough about John Adams and Jefferson. Now we're going to talk about Jeffersonian democracy. So this includes Thomas Jefferson, um, Madison, James Madison, and Monroe. All three of their presidencies, although Monroe's kind of a transition period. We'll talk about that probably in the next lecture. For now, Thomas Jefferson had some things he wanted to accomplish. Do you remember that excess tax on whiskey that ended up promulgating the Whiskey Rebellion? Well, that excess tax is gone. The U.S. also had raised military spending for the Navy because Adams was fighting a quasi-war with France due to many things that we talked about in the last lecture. Well, that military spending, gone. He also wanted the national government to have a smaller role in general than what it was having. Remember, you had Federalists who wanted a strong central government with lots of power, and then you had Anti-Federalists who kind of sort of reorganized into the Democratic Republicans who wanted the government to have little or less power. So this leads us into the debate of strict versus loose interpretation of the Constitution. Democratic Republicans thought that the Constitution should be interpreted strictly. In other words, if the Constitution did not explicitly say the federal government could do something, then they couldn't. Loose interpretations, aka Federalist, thought that the federal government could go beyond the Constitution as long as they didn't violate the Constitution. This is why Hamilton was able to set up a national bank. So despite that belief, though, Thomas Jefferson did keep some of the Federalist policies in place that were not explicitly stated in the Constitution, such as the national bank and the continued debt repayment of state debts. He also did keep the Federalist policy of remaining neutral on the international stage, which will change when we get to Madison as well as Monroe. But Jefferson then did something that expanded the power of the national government beyond what both John Adams and George Washington did. You see, the Constitution does not say who has the power to expand and purchase land. However, Jefferson decides to buy the Louisiana Territory. So, Louisiana Purchase took place in 1803. We bought it, the United States bought it from France. If you remember correctly, France had lost Louisiana Territory to the Spanish during the 7 Years' Wars, also known in North America as the French and Indian War. But Napoleon had actually won the territory back from Spain during his military campaigns in Europe. Jefferson had initially sent a delegation to gain important access to New Orleans and the Mississippi River. However, Napoleon had other ideas. Instead, he wanted to sell the entire territory of Louisiana for a measly $15 million, or about 3.5 cents per acre. That's a rough estimate. For Jefferson, this created a constitutional predicament. Remember, he believes in a strict interpretation, meaning the Constitution doesn't say the president can buy this land. However, he decides to be a hypocrite because the deal was too daggum good to pass up. So he purchased it for $15 million. This created a national vision with Jefferson. He wanted to expand the United States from sea to shining sea, and this idea began rising up in the American public, coming to fruition during the 1830s with an idea called Manifest Destiny. We'll talk a lot about that Manifest Destiny a little bit later on, But just know, manifest destiny, if you already know what it is, then that doesn't begin until the 1830s, and then it was revitalized later on in the 1800s. But with all this new land, Jefferson had to do something, so he funded the Lewis and Clark expedition to catalog the newly purchased land. So on this map, you can see a couple different treaty lines that were made. You had the Adams-Onis Treaty. This would be John Quincy Adams in 1819, uh, which just helps set the border between Spain and the United States. The U.S. and Britain also created a treaty line, and some of the land was seceded to both Spain. Britain also took some control of some of the land from the United States as part of these different treaties. The Oregon Country is a very interesting one. You're probably going to, your summer or your winter break assignment is going to be looking at tensions in the Oregon Territory and how it almost caused a war between the United States and Britain, since they were both occupying that land. For now, just know they joint occupied the Oregon Territory. The United States also did get access to Florida, finally, in 1819, during the presidency of Monroe. In 1804, Jefferson was reelected, but this time Burr was up to some stuff. Also, instead of having the Electoral College vote for the president and the vice presidency, the 12th Amendment was passed, and now the president could have a running mate. Jefferson's running mate was George Clinton. His opposition was Charles Pinckney. If you remember for the Pinckney Treaty, that's the same guy. Burr decided, instead of running for the presidency, that he was going to try and instead get the governorship of New York. He secretly formed a political pact with some radical New England Federalists in 1804, but ultimately it failed. This caused a lot of tension. Burr was tried for treason. He dueled Hamilton, which ended up with the death of Alexander Hamilton. And Burr ran away and tried to start his own country. It's a whole thing. Burr is a character. But Jefferson was elected in 1804. This second term was pretty uneventful for Jefferson. It just kind of maintained a status quo effect. The U.S. did expand a little bit, and of course, the exploration of Louisiana Territory was still taking place during this time, as it was a lot of land. Lots and lots of land. And now we're going to backtrack a little bit. Remember those midnight judges I was talking about that Adams had tried to appoint with the Federalists before he got pulled out? Well, Jefferson refused to appoint them, and one of the judges who was supposed to be appointed sued the U.S. government. The Supreme Court, with John Marshall as the Supreme Court Justice, made the decision on the suit. So they were the ones who were in charge of dictating whether or not Marbury should have been appointed to his judgeship. The first thing that the court decided in John Marshall's decision was that Marbury was right to sue, and he was appointed to a judgeship, and thus he should be appointed. However, the Supreme Court found that the law that appointed Marbury to the judgeship was illegal. It was unconstitutional. Thus, Marbury did not get his judgeship in the end. This decision established the primacy of the judiciary and determined the meaning of the Constitution, and asserted that federal laws took precedence over state laws, also known as federalism. Federalism, again, is the separation of power between the national and state governments, but federal law in the United States took precedence over state law. It also set up the system of judicial review. Judicial review. Judicial review. Judicial review is a big thing. Judicial review allows for the Supreme Court to determine whether laws are constitutional or not. We still see these effects today, as all of the Supreme Court cases are judicial review. So this case is kind of a big deal. John Marshall is also a big deal, and we'll talk about him more as we go through period 4. For now, that is where we are going to stop for today. A reading quiz for the next chapter is posted online. Otherwise, have a great day.